Hi guys, welcome to the last video in this lesson. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the effects of estrogen and progesterone on the reproductive tract, and then we'll wrap it up with a very, very brief mention of menopause. So here is a table that's also in your notes. It's demonstrating the effects of estrogen and progesterone upon the female reproductive tract. Estrogen increases cellular formation and activity and increases contraction of the fallopian tubes. And what this does is it causes transport of the ovum down the tubes toward the uterus. Of course, this is your corpus luteal, your luteal phase. These are effects during the luteal phase. This is an effect during the luteal phase. Estrogen's effect on the uterus is to increase proliferation of the endometrium and increase the growth and contractility of the myometrium. Actually, this increased growth and proliferation of the endometrium is taking place, as we'll see in a moment, during the follicular phase. So this is an effect of estrogen during that phase where you're causing the endometrium to build and grow and become this nice soft pad for your potentially fertilized ovum to implant itself in. Watery secretions really help with sperm transport. Sperm gets through that quite a bit easier. So we're maintaining the uterus and its blood supply basically with the estrogen. The increased contractility here facilitates the movement of sperm up the reproductive tract. We have this proliferation of the endometrium, and we're increasing progesterone receptors in preparation of the luteal phase, where this endometrium will be stabilized and kept until physiologically you're certain you don't need it anymore. And then we have the vagina, increased epithelial proliferation and increased glycogen deposition. Basically, we're helping the sperm along, giving it things that it might need to increase its transport and facilitate it up the reproductive tract. Okay, as far as progesterone goes, some of these effects are the opposite of estrogen, in particular on contractility. So we're decreasing contractility and we're increasing secretion, and what that does is it generates more mucus. So the mucus actually flows up the fallopian tubes, and so this actually facilitates the transport of sperm up toward the ovum, which is coming down. Okay. In the case of the uterus, this decreased contractility sort of keeps you from ejecting an early fetus, so it protects against accidentally, getting rid of that, particularly in the luteal phase where fertilization might be taking place. And of course, that's where progesterone is higher here, so that would make sense here as well. You are also generating a cervical plug, a sort of plug of viscous secretions, thick secretion, dense secretion, which sort of plugs up the cervix during this phase. And then we have preparation of the vagina basically for our pregnancy. Your progesterone during this luteal phase is basically maintaining the female reproductive tract in a state that will facilitate implantation in pregnancy. So eventually what will happen is that endometrial layer will disintegrate and fall apart. That will take place again late in the luteal phase. So the end of that phase, you've got the estrogen and the progesterone going down because your corpus luteum is starting to die off. That increases lysosomal enzymes within the endometrial layer. That activates phospholipase, which generates arachidonic acid, which increases prostaglandins. And then your prostaglandins actually cause a vasoconstriction in the endometrial layer, and that causes ischemia, so you're cutting off oxygen and nutrients from getting there, and these cells die off and then they slough away, and what you get is bleeding from the vagina. Okay, and of course that's the end of your menstrual cycle. You start your cycle over again with the follicular phase after that. So this is sort of what the endometrium looks like as we progress through the menstrual cycle. So here we have our follicular phase. Estrogen is high, progesterone is not. So the estrogen is causing this proliferation of the endometrium, which I mentioned, and your endometrium is increasing. You're getting an increase in these invaginations here, and you're forming a nice pad for implantation to take place in should that happen. Then we enter the luteal phase. Now estrogen is still high and it's helping to maintain this, but now progesterone is also stabilizing this endometrium and keeping it nice and high and increased and thick, and again ready to go should implantation take place. And then finally the corpus luteum dies off when we enter the late luteal phase, slopping into the follicular phase again, and the endometrium dies off, and you get vaginal bleeding from the vagina. All right, so that wraps that up. Let's talk a little bit about menopause here. Menopause is basically the permanent cessation of cycling. You guys know that. Typically it happens between 45 and 55 years. It can happen as early as 35 and as late as 65. It's due to, quote, ovarian failure. The responsiveness to LH and FSH of the follicles is what follicles remain, is reduced. And so what you get is less estrogen and progesterone reduced. And so that sort of causes many of the effects of menopause that you see. This drop in estrogen in particular produces many of those effects. The adrenal cortex becomes the major producer of the sex hormones post-menopause, and the adrenal cortex does not produce nearly as much of those, nor is what it produces as potent as the ovaries do. So you get this decrease in estrogen, and that has some of the effects that I mentioned in the overview lesson. The most prominent of which are the effects on bone for our purposes, osteoporosis, which you learned a lot about in the movement and mechanics block. So one thing I do want to point out, this is a figure from earlier as well, from the overview lecture lesson. So here are our changes in the gonadotropins during the different phases of life. So here's the reproductive years, and these are LH surges as the female cycles through. And notice here, later, you get this sustained increase in LH and FSH. And this is due to the fact that you're not getting any negative feedback from estrogen anymore. And so lack of estrogen leads to a sustained level of FSH and LH here in those postmenopausal years. So some of the consequences, fertility ceases, of course, and estrogen is a target for a lot of different tissues and has a lot of different effects, and the lack of estrogen is going to cause many of those effects to become prominent. Again, osteoporosis, brittle bones being one that certainly is of note. You get vaginal dryness, thinning of the vaginal wall, breast tenderness, loss of muscle tone and strength, and increased risk of heart attack due to the lack of estrogen's effect on the cardiovascular system. And again, we went over some of that in the overview and introductory lesson, and just sort of a quick review of some of this here, as it sort of seems to feed into our talk of the cycle. So that's it for the female reproduction lesson. Thank you for your attention, and I'll see you guys in the rooms.